Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. They say the darkest secrets of America aren't buried in graves, but inside the bloodlines that never left their own houses. Imagine a man whose first breath was already a curse. His face, his body, his very soul, marked by generations who chose to ignore the natural order. He was not born of strangers, nor even of distant cousins, but of brother and sister. And from the moment he opened his eyes, the world recoiled. To look upon him was to see the wages of sin etched into flesh. This man, once hidden in the hollows of forgotten land, became a living testament to what happens when a family locks its doors and turns inward forever. People whispered about him, some in pity, others in horror, but few dared to approach, because when you saw him you didn't just see a man, you saw the reflection of something older, something rotten, something that should have never been allowed to grow. He carried the story of his people in his bones, a family that folded in upon itself, generation after generation, until the blood grew too heavy to carry. By the time he was born, his fate was sealed. Every twitch of his hand, every crooked glance, every uneven step was proof that the family tree had stopped branching, and instead had begun to strangle itself. But here is the part they don't want you to hear. This man did not live in some distant medieval court or under the rule of forgotten kings. No. His story belongs to the soil of America, hidden in plain sight, among the poorest corners, in places where the outside world had long stopped looking. And there, inside that silence, he slept each night beside his own sister. It wasn't just whispered gossip, it was his life, repeated with the casual certainty of ritual. The photographs that survive of him are difficult to look at, not because of cruelty or violence, but because they force us to face something primal. His eyes, wide and uneven, his mouth hanging, never quite closed, his body bent before its time. These features, grotesque to some, are simply the final echo of a lineage that refused to break free. He was not a monster by choice, he was the living evidence of a family curse. And yet, despite his deformities, despite the truth of his bloodline, he lived, he breathed, he loved, in ways that we cannot bear to speak aloud. They called it survival, but what survived was something else entirely. His family lived in isolation, far from towns, far from churches, far from any watchful eyes that might have stopped what was happening behind those walls. Poverty cloaked them like a second skin, but poverty alone does not breed this kind of ruin. It was choice, or perhaps compulsion, that kept them bound to one another. Brother to sister, mother to son, uncle to niece. The cycle was unbroken, and the children bore the scars. When neighbors caught sight of them, whispers followed. Children pointed and laughed, while their parents lowered their voices to mutter words like degenerate, tainted, and not right. The family became shadows, creatures of rumor, mentioned only when someone needed to warn their own children of what happens when you go too far. But behind closed doors, the cycle continued. The man whose story we tell tonight became its darkest expression. He was known for his silence. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words came slow, thick, and broken. But silence does not mean ignorance. He knew what he was. He saw it in the way strangers recoiled. He felt it in the way his body betrayed him, spasms, twitches, and a face that seemed carved by something not entirely human. And yet, in the stillness of night, he would lay beside the one person who was both his comfort and his curse, his own sister. To outsiders, the thought alone is unbearable, but inside that house, it was treated as ordinary, even inevitable. Their parents had done the same, their grandparents too. For them, there was no shame left to feel. The rituals of kinship had twisted into something unholy, until the blood itself no longer knew where it began or ended. He was simply following the only script ever handed down to him. But here is the chilling part. He was not hidden away forever. There are photographs. There are testimonies. His life bled into the records of social workers, of doctors, of curious researchers who stumbled upon the truth, and those records, cold and clinical, describe him as though he were less than human. They tally his deformities like numbers on a ledger, never pausing to wonder what it felt like to live inside his skin, to be the man everyone stared at, but no one ever saw. He became infamous, not because of crimes he committed, but because of the blood that created him. A human being transformed into a cautionary tale. The world has a way of forgetting people like him, but forgetting does not erase what was real. His body told the truth in every movement, and his life was the living archive of generations that refused to change. He was not educated in schools. He was not taught the laws of men or the words of God. His lessons were taught by the four walls of his crumbling home and by the family members who shared his blood twice over. To him, there was no other life to imagine. What he had been given was what he believed the world was. He would sit on the porch for hours, staring at the road as though waiting for someone to come down it, but few ever did. Visitors who stumbled close described him as unsettling, his gaze too direct, his smile too vacant. Some said his presence felt like a warning, a reminder that human beings could warp into something unrecognizable if left in the wrong conditions long enough. Yet he was not without emotions. Accounts describe him laughing in sudden bursts, dancing clumsily to music that only he seemed to hear, even clapping his hands like a child when food was set before him. In those fleeting moments, he seemed innocent, almost untouched by the horror of his lineage. But innocence, in his case, was not salvation. It was tragedy. Because behind every smile lingered the truth of how he had come to exist and who he shared his bed with when night fell. What makes his story so haunting is not just the grotesque image of his face or the whispers of his family's rituals. It is the quiet knowledge that he too was human. He loved in his own way. He reached out for touch, for companionship, for the warmth of another body beside his own. The tragedy is that the only body offered to him was his sister's, and in that act, repeated across years, the curse was sealed again. The outsiders who documented his existence could never decide what to call him. Some called him the most inbred man alive. Others referred to him as a case study, but to those who knew him, he was simply a brother, a son, a man who had never been given a chance to be anything else. And so he lived, suspended between humanity and myth. A man not fully remembered, yet never entirely forgotten. The photographs that remain are not kind, black and white, grainy, taken with the cold precision of documentation rather than compassion. In them he appears almost spectral, eyes wandering in different directions, jaw heavy and slack, body folded in on itself as though weighed down by the history inside him. To study those images is to stare at the end of a bloodline collapsing under its own weight. But the photographs only tell part of the story. Those who saw him in person speak of something that a camera could not capture. They describe a presence that unsettled even the most hardened men. It was not violence that disturbed them. He was never known for aggression, but a sense that he carried with him a mirror to something people wished never to confront. A mirror that showed the fragility of civilization itself. Strip away the rules, the churches, the town squares, and what is left? Families turning inward generation after generation until blood itself becomes poison. He did not choose this path, and yet his face became a symbol of it. Journalists and researchers used him as evidence, pointing to his deformities like proof in a courtroom. They wrote reports with words like degeneration, abnormality, consequence. He was dissected in language, treated as though his existence was nothing more than the end product of a cruel experiment. But behind those words, behind the ink on paper, there was still a man who woke each morning, who ate when he was hungry, who looked for warmth where he could find it. And it was in the arms of his sister that he found it. Outsiders call it incest, sin, abomination. Inside his house it was survival, it was routine, it was life as it had always been. The bed they shared was not just the mark of their bond, but the continuation of a legacy older than either of them. Each night when the lanterns went out they lay together as two. Oh, there was no other choice. And in truth, there wasn't. Not for them. The horror of his story is not in the act itself, but in how ordinary it was for those who lived it. That ordinariness, the absence of shame, the lack of awareness, is what makes it unbearable to us now. He did not know he was committing a crime against nature. He only knew he was following the rhythm handed down by the blood that made him. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? As years passed, his body aged faster than his years. The deformities that marked his childhood only deepened with time, bones stiffening, speech slurring into near silence, his walk becoming a shuffle that seemed to drag the entire history of his family behind it. To look at him was to see more than a man. It was to see generations stacked upon generations, each refusing to break free from the last. His body was the living archive of every choice that had been made before him. Neighbors spoke of him in hushed tones, warning children not to stare if they passed by. Some described him as simple, others as strange, but none could truly name what he was. The truth was too unsettling. He had become the kind of figure people invent folklore around, a living ghost haunting the outskirts of American memory. Inside his home, life carried on as if nothing were unusual. His sister, his companion, his partner, his mirror, remained by his side. They shared meals from chipped plates, sat by fires that burned too low, and retreated each night into the same bed, their breaths mingling in the silence. There was no rebellion, no plan to escape, no dream of a life beyond those walls. Their world was small, self-contained, and irreversible. What's most chilling is how society responded. For some, he was a freak to be studied. For others, he was proof of decay in forgotten America. But almost no one treated him as a man with dignity. His humanity was stripped away, piece by piece, until he was left only as the most inbred man alive. That title clung to him like a shroud, reducing his existence to a single grotesque fact. Yet there is a haunting irony here. In his silence, in his crooked smile, in his persistence to live day after day, he carried a truth we are too afraid to admit. That human beings can endure almost anything, that love, no matter how twisted, will find its way in, to even the darkest places, and that once the world forgets you, the rules it made no longer apply. He did not rage against his fate. He did not beg for freedom. He simply lived, day after day, night after night, inside a cycle too old and too broken to ever be undone. By the time outsiders truly began to take notice, the damage had already been done. The man's life was no longer his own. It was evidence, a case study, a specimen for the curious and the horrified. Social workers came with their notebooks, doctors with their cameras, researchers with their cold questions. Each one treated him like a puzzle to be solved, never as a soul who felt pain or longed for warmth. His family was spoken of in the language of science, as if their suffering could be reduced to charts and diagrams. He became famous, but not in a way any man would wish. His face circulated in photographs meant to shock, his story retold in whispers meant to entertain. To strangers, he was no longer a person. He was an object, a warning, a grotesque curiosity. And yet, behind those images, he still woke each day in the same bed, beside the same sister, living the same life that had been written for him before he was born. There is something unbearably tragic about the way his humanity was erased. He had moments of joy, however brief. He clapped to music, laughed at small things, cherished the only companionship he was allowed to know. But none of that was recorded. History preserved only the horror, only the deformities, only the incest, as though those alone defined him, as though a man could be boiled down to the sins of his ancestors and the shape of his bones. And so he slipped into legend, not through greatness, not through choice, but through the relentless gaze of a world that needed him to be something less than human. He was a symbol of decay, of degeneration, of everything people feared about bloodlines gone wrong. And yet, he breathed. He dreamed in his own way. He loved in his own way. He existed in the cracks between horror and humanity. His story forces us to ask an unbearable question. When blood itself becomes a prison, what does freedom even look like? For him, it was never a possibility. He was born into a cage with no door, and when he died, the cage died with him. But the memory remains, the photographs remain, and the lesson remains, carved into the silence of American history like a wound that refuses to heal. There is no ending to his story that feels clean, no redemption, no sudden escape, no miracle that pulled him from the house where his blood betrayed him. He lived as he was born, entangled in a lineage that never let him go. And when death finally came, it was not a release celebrated by the world, but a quiet passing, swallowed up by the same obscurity that had always surrounded him. His body was laid to rest, but the whispers continued. They always do. What remains is not just the image of a man bent by deformity, nor the scandal of a bed shared with his sister. What remains is the deeper horror, the reminder that families can become prisons, that blood can become a curse, and that entire histories can vanish into silence until one day they resurface in a photograph too disturbing to look at. He was not alone in this. Across the forgotten corners of America, there were others like him, lives twisted by isolation, poverty, and choices never unmade. But he became the symbol, the most infamous face of a truth no one wanted to admit. And so, even now, his story endures, not because people want to remember him, but because they cannot forget. His face, once hidden in shadows, is now a relic of warning. A mirror held up to show us the cost of silence, the cost of shame, the cost of closing the door and pretending the world beyond does not exist. But perhaps the most haunting part is this. He did not see himself the way we see him. To him, his life was not horror. It was simply life. The bed he shared, the body he carried, the laughter he found, the stares he endured. He did not know he was a legend. He did not know he was a warning. He only knew he was alive, and sometimes that was enough. The photographs remain, the reports remain, the whispers remain. They tell us of a man born into a story he could never rewrite. And as we stare into his uneven eyes, as we trace the lines of his broken face, we are forced to reckon with the truth that the past does not always stay buried. Sometimes it lives on in blood. Sometimes it sleeps beside you. And sometimes it looks back at you through the eyes of the most inbred man alive.